Hello, everyone, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, observing the launch of REN21’s Renewables in Cities 2019 Global Status Report, which is the first edition of an important new report series. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Vicki Healy, a project manager for the Clean Energy Solutions Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. We have a great presentation lined up for you today, and we are glad you are joining us. I will begin briefly by covering some of the webinar basics so that all of you, our attendees, know how to participate as an attendee, and I'll provide a short overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center. And then after that, we will hear from our great presenter, Ms. Rana Abdi, Executive Secretary at REN21. And then following the presentation, we will take questions submitted by you, the audience. And this section will be moderated by REN21’s Outreach and Communications Manager, Laura Williamson. Lastly, just to let you know, after the webinar concludes, there will be a short survey that will be displayed. And we ask that you do us a favor and just take a couple of minutes to answer the questions to let us know how we did today. Your feedback is really very important to us. So before we begin, I'll just go over some of the webinar features. First, for audio, you have two options, which you may either listen through your computer or over your telephone. And if you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio pane. And then you can also dial in by phone. And if you select to do the audio through the telephone option, you'll see that on within a box on the right-hand side that will display the telephone number and the audio pin, should you select that option. And just to help you out a little bit more, we did, and to illustrate the features a bit more clearly, we've taken a screenshot of an example of what the interface for attendees looks like. You should see something like this. It looks like this on your computer desktop, located in the right upper corner of your screen. So you'll also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into that little questions box on the control panel. And you may send in your questions at any time throughout the presentations. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's event is being recorded, so if you would like to review the webinar or share this information with others, an audio recording and presentations will be soon posted to the Clean Energy Solutions Center training page and added to the Solutions Center YouTube channel. You see the links here on this slide where you'll be able to find the presentations, not only this one, but others that we've presented in the past. And also you'll receive an email within the next day or so with a link to access the webinar. The Clean Energy Solutions Center, I'd just like to give you a very short overview of what we are and what we do. It is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. The Solutions Center operates through very generous support from the Australian and US governments, and is structured to help governments design and adopt policies and programs that support the deployment of clean energy technologies. This help is provided through what we call an Ask an Expert technical assistance service, which is offered to governments free of charge, and it is designed to allow experts to respond quickly to questions. The Solutions Center also engages in capacity building activities, such as this webinar you are attending today. So now I'd like to introduce our very esteemed panelist, Ms. Rana Abdi. She is the Executive Secretary at the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century, which is more widely known as REN21. Previously, Rana was REN21’s research coordinator and developed the international expert community, and she led the REN21 Renewables Global Status Report series to become a leading and esteemed international reference. Over the years, Rana has worked in private industry and applied research in the renewable energy, energy access, and waste management areas. And Rana earned her master's degree in industrial engineering and has over 20 years experience in the energy sector. Following Rana's presentation, we will have a question and answer session moderated by Laura Williams, REN21’s Outreach and Communication Manager. Laura is responsible for directing outreach and communication activities at REN21 and works on other activities such as strategic development and coordinating the biennial International Renewable Energy Conference. One was just recently held in South Korea. Previous to joining REN21, Laura was the project director for Helio International, which is an international think tank focused on developing renewable energy solutions. She was also a program manager with the UN Environment Program, where she led work on industry and sustainability issues. Laura holds degrees from the University of Chicago and Tufts University, and she has more than 20 years experience in the field of renewable energy. So with those introductions complete, I would now like to invite and welcome Rana Adi to begin her presentation. Rana, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thanks a lot for this introduction, and in particular also thanks a lot for the opportunity to have a webinar. Hello everybody at the different areas in the world. We are really excited at REN21 that we are launching the first edition of the new report series, the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report. So I will maybe before going into the topic, and for the ones of you who don't know us yet, quickly explain who we are, and then you'll also understand why we are looking into such a topic. REN21 is the only global community of actors from science, industry, governments, NGOs, and all these players really working together to advance renewable energy uptake. We are providing fact-based and peer-reviewed data and analyses with the objective to inform decision makers to really implement renewable energy, and not tomorrow but now, because climate crisis clearly underlined the urgency, but also because renewable energy significantly contributes to advancing social and economic developments in the world. So our main report, or what we're very much known for, is the Renewables Global Status Report, where we are reporting on the status of renewable energy worldwide since 2005. We also have regional reports, and now the cities report on the status part. There are some other report series, but the objective really is to bring this evidence and knowledge into the debates, with the objective to inform, raise the awareness, but really also give decision makers the tools and proofs at hand that it makes sense to engage in the renewable energy transition. Now, why are we excited about the cities report? I think it's very clear that cities have been, sorry, I'll come back. Why are we focusing here? Cities are very clearly showing a lot of ambition in terms of renewable energy uptake. That's something a trend which we can see since a couple of years. And the reality is that renewable energy in its decentralized nature and scale really allows cities to become a key actor in the transition and key players in the transition, moving from energy consumer only to also energy producers. The other question with regard to the political ambition, it is really important to understand how this political ambition also translates into concrete actions and development of renewable energy market, energy generation, etc. Another reason why we're looking into cities is that obviously at the urban space, we have some key energy consuming sectors coming together. There are many buildings, there is industry, there is infrastructure, and there is a lot of transportation, and obviously the consumption of street, whether it is in street lighting, buildings, information technology, communication. So cities are basically at this crossing of these different sectors, and can as such also be significant players when it comes to a stronger integration of these energy consuming sectors. The other aspect is also renewable energy presents a key opportunities for cities. Now, the reality is, however, that data is dispersed, partly not existing, it's not homogeneous, and it's also not consolidated. And here we clearly have REN21’s strengths, I think, strengths kicking in. When we're looking at the data gaps which do exist, there is no consolidated information on which policies and targets exist. No consolidated information on the generation of renewable energy in cities, the share of renewables either at the municipal level or in the city, the generation capacities, but also the investment, because obviously we know that renewable energy deployment also means investment and economic opportunities. At the city level, we have a particularity, which is the development also of citizens' projects. Now, this report really had the objective to bring light into these different topics. And REN21 for this really has a specific culture to approach this, because we're building all our reporting on a community of experts, international experts, who will participate in a collaborative data collection process and a peer review process. So we consolidate these formal and informal data, not only energy statistics, but also informal data, have an open peer review, and develop, I guess, kind of a language where all the players do agree that these are numbers that can be used. And now I'm going back to my slides. I'm sorry, they are not in the right order. It's because it's the first time we're presenting it like this. So what are the Renewables in Cities 2019 Global Status Report? So I spoke about the community. First, it's a community of 380 contributors, and I think this is something which is quite outstanding for a first edition of a report series. We have conducted more than 50 interviews, and what is also interesting, and I think a really good indication for the fact that it's an opportunity to bring renewable energy to the city environment, more than 60% of the contributors are not part of the traditional or historic REN21 community, but new contributors. When we're looking at the report, it's an annual stocktake of renewable energy in cities. We're looking in this edition into generally the role of cities in the renewable energy transition, the drivers for renewable energy in cities. Then, similar to the Global States report, we're looking into policies and regulatory frameworks, so targets and policies here, because they are key in advancing renewable energy, but then also looking into urban renewable energy markets. So how does this translate? The other part is the mobilization of finance and enabling business models and the city participation. Okay, now I'll come to the results. So just to recall the importance of cities. Cities are responsible for 2/3 of the total final energy consumption in the world. And this also means that they are responsible for 75% of global CO2 emissions. So I think here we clearly see that they have a key role, basically, when we're talking about decarbonization and climate crisis. There are 55% of the population living in cities, and this is increasing. And interestingly, 80% of GDP, global GDP, is allocated and generated in cities. And this really shows the economic weight cities have. Also, when we're obviously renewable energy deployment also means investment, there is a real interest in involving cities in these developments. The other aspect, and I've mentioned it in the beginning, is the urban infrastructure. So the building and construction sector representing final energy of 36% and 40% of the CO2 emissions, airports, ports, but also the generation of solid waste. And here is a clear opportunity to move, basically, to develop also circular economy at the city level. I'll come back to this later. Now, just to remind all of us, when we're speaking about the renewable energy transition, we do not only speak about power. Power represents 17% of the total final energy demand. Heating and cooling represents 51% and transport 32%. It is very clear that renewable energy has been a success in the power sector, in particular with the uptake of solar photovoltaics and wind, and reached a share of renewable energy in the sector of 26%. When we're looking into heating and cooling and transport, the situation is unfortunately quite different, with a stable 10% and a stable, slightly increasing 3% for transport sector. So this means that these sectors are really lagging behind. And this is also a motivation why we're looking very much on the role of cities here. The reasons for this are heating and cooling is more or less split up 50-50 between buildings and industry. And the building stock in urban environments is very significant. Also, heating and cooling markets are local markets, so very often handled at the municipal level. Urban transport, on the other hand, represents 40% of the final energy demand in the transport sector. So there is very clearly a motivation from the energy side to also look into cities. Now, what do we observe? So in all our discussions, and I think this is something which is quite an interesting outcome, not only for the city discussion, but also more globally, renewable energy is not only driven in cities for climate change reasons. It's driven for various different reasons. We see that cities have very clearly a direct responsibility for their residents and are much closer to the citizens with regard to this, and also to make sure that citizens have a healthy and are living in livable urban areas, healthy areas, and have a better quality of life. So this closeness, I guess, to the population and citizens is very important. The other aspect, clearly, especially when we're looking into the reduced energy or renewable energy costs in particular in the power sector, is that renewable energy also offers the possibility to reduce municipal costs. This is, for instance, a trend we very much see when we're looking into the development of efficient and solar PV-based street lighting. There are also opportunities for economic development and local job creation. And that's something which is important when we're looking. I spoke about the decentralized nature of renewable energy. When we're looking into this, it also means that there is a possibility to produce local renewable energy, but also generate local income. And that's something which is fundamental, really of key importance for local governments. Obviously, the other aspect is energy security. When we are looking at the energy situation in many cities, in the developing world, for instance, and being able to ensure 100% reliable energy supply is fundamental. And in these regions, also access to energy. There is one other aspect, which is really a key driver, and we see this in many cities, and this is air pollution. Air pollution today is a major, I think it's the fourth largest health risk which humanity is facing, with 4.2 billion premature deaths. And cities are very much concerned by this, and we clearly see that this is often a concern very much for the citizens living in cities. And as a result, the policymaker at the local level are responding to this major concern. That's one aspect. And here, efficiency, energy efficiency, the development of electric mobility, for instance, public transportation, more optimized urban planning are key, but also the switch to less emitting fuel in terms of air pollution. Also, air pollution does have high economic costs. For OECD, there is an assessment of $1.8 trillion per year. For the BRICS countries, oh, there's one I too much, $3 trillion. When you're looking at the map here, I think it's important to mention that on Africa, we don't see many dots, but this is very much linked to the fact that there is a lack of monitoring stations in this continent. Now, here you will see basically the link between air pollution and renewable energy. So the yellow dots from these capital cities are the ones that also have a renewable energy target. So almost half of the world's most polluted capital cities have a renewable energy target. And in 2019, 35 cities committed to air pollution reduction targets and clean air policy. So there's also the possibility here to position renewable energy very differently in the debate. And this is, for instance, quite interesting in situations in countries and cities where we are encountering challenges in terms of social acceptance of renewable energy. Now, cities do have various roles basically in the transition. One role is very clearly when we're looking at their municipal operations. The other one is more citywide, and I think that's something which is really fundamental to make the distinction, because the entry points are different. Then obviously statewide at the national level and at the global level. I'll come to these later. At the municipal level, we do see that cities for their municipal operation are shifting actually their consumption to renewable energy. That's one thing, so with subscribing power purchase agreements, for instance, but also shifting into their own generation. And I think that's really something where cities are empowered by renewable energy. When it comes to their constituents, cities can really engage local stakeholders in their energy and climate plans, and also respond to local stakeholders' demands for action. Local policies are here an important tool for encouraging basically the greater uptake by the different city players, whether these are the residents, but also businesses and industry, but also infrastructure operators. Cities do also help to increase the acceptance of renewable energy, and they are very clearly trendsetters influencing and advocating for more renewable energy. We'll see this later when we're looking into the targets. Now, what we do observe is that cities, when you see the individual city, they might have a lot of weight, obviously, but when you see it at the global scale, one city is probably not the major change agent, but cities do engage altogether in city networks. And I think that's really something which is very important in terms of voicing the city concern in the energy debates at the national level and the city level. Now, here on this slide, we have basically the different roles of cities as target setters, energy consumers, energy producers, owners and operators of infrastructure, regulators and policymakers, facilitators and aggregators, financing entities, urban planners, and also champions and trendsetters and advocates. And you will see that depending on the level, the influence and the responsibility is varying. So now let's look more deeply into cities' targets and so ambition and policies. So here on this slide, we have 100% renewable energy targets in cities as of mid-2019. These are building on various databases we found. It's partly also self-reporting databases. So that's something which is really important to keep in mind, because we do see that, and that's also something we will build up over time, I think, to really have a stronger understanding of what these targets really mean. Is it municipal or citywide? Is it energy or electricity? Because we have indications here, so they are informed, but that's certainly something where we collectively need to work towards a stronger coherence, I guess. Regardless of this part, when we're looking here at the 100% renewable energy targets in cities, we do see two things. One thing is that their engagements are, or their targets are often higher. So when we compare it, for instance, with national governments, But they are also broader. What does this mean broader? We do see that historically they started in having renewable power targets, but we see an increasing amount also of targets for transport and for heating and cooling, but also energy in total. And I think that is something which is really, really important, because if you recall one of the first slides, it is fundamental if we're serious about climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals to move from an electricity transition to an energy transition. Globally, there are 250 cities identified that have adopted some form of 100% renewable energy target. And interestingly, and that's on the right side, most of these are citywide targets. And I think this really shows that cities and city governments clearly see themselves as also facilitator at the city level, and not only for their municipal operations. What is a function of targets? Obviously, I think one question which always comes up is, are these targets binding, yes or no? This is something which will depend very much on the cities. There is no general rule. What is a good indication how serious a target is when we do have cities which have a roadmap on how to reach this target. In general, targets really provide a greater longer-term certainty to residents, company, and investors, and help mobilize stakeholders, but also finance. I would like to look into one specific target, because very often when we're talking about the transport sector and renewable energy in transport, there is obviously directly the idea about many people and many cities think e-mobility. And e-mobility really has a very important function, because it reduces the energy consumption a lot, the development of public transportation, optimization. So that's one part, but then moving from a combustion engine to an electric vehicle is already reducing more or less the energy consumption by 2/3. So that's obviously a first part which is important. Now, the electricity consumed in electric vehicles globally is approximately of 25%. And here there is a clear opportunities for cities to have a much stronger integrated planning of the transition in the transport sector to integrate this stronger with the energy transition by linking basically e-mobility targets together with renewable energy. Unfortunately, when we're looking at the targets, so on the right slide, you do have the e-mobility targets or countries with e-mobility targets. I think there were, sorry, I don't recall the number of cities. Yes, more than 50 cities, sorry. More than 50 cities do have urban e-mobility targets. What we see is that less than 6% were directly linked to renewable energy. 52% of the cities do have e-mobility targets and renewable power targets, so in line but not integrated. And 42 cities do have an e-mobility target. 42% of the cities do have an e-mobility target, but no renewable power target. This is clearly something where an area we have identified where cities' target setting can improve towards a more integrated approach. Now, when we're looking at the policies, because obviously when you have a target and a vision, it's important to put in place policies and regulatory frameworks to reach this. Policies can be divided in two main categories from what we've seen. There are policies targeting the municipalities' own operations, and then we have citywide energy use policies. On the municipal operations, it's mainly city procurement, which is a key enabler here. And this is true whether it is infrastructure, which is handled by the municipality themselves, but also when it is operated by private sector players. I will not go into detail here per sector, but we do see differences between the different sectors, whether it is electricity, heating and cooling, in particular for building industry, and the transport sector. When it comes to citywide policy, there are two aspects or two approaches. One is mandates and obligations, and the other one is fiscal and financial mechanisms. So these are the two biggest parts. Now, this basically, when we're looking into the municipal operation, it is very clear that cities do have a significant authority to scale up renewable energy in their municipal operations. And this is something which is regardless the governance structure you encounter in the different countries. And this really means that they have the possibility in a quite autonomous way to shift their consumption, their energy consumption to renewable energy consumption. Now, as an example, so I'll just mention some examples, but I invite you, I will not go very much into detail here on examples. I invite you to read the report here. But Georgetown, for instance, in the US, the municipal utility in Georgetown now already meets 100% of their electricity needs from 2 wind projects and 1 solar PV project. So in this case, we're really seeing that they are building their own generation, building up their own generation to meet their targets. The reality is also, when we're talking about 100% renewable energy targets, that we see that these can be reached in an easier way in countries where there is already a good renewable energy supply in the electric grids, for instance. There are also some pilot projects, and what we see here is that cities are clearly using some visible public projects, buildings, etc., to engage in the renewable energy transition, because it does also contribute to inform and raise the awareness. So in Melbourne, for instance, the city of Melbourne joins with cultural institutions, universities, local companies, and other municipalities in a collective purchase of renewable electricity generation from a newly built wind farm. So this also shows that we have the possibility, and what we observe is that cities bring together different stakeholders to engage in the project. In the heating and cooling sectors, for instance, Copenhagen has developed a plan to really transition to district heating and 100% renewable energy in district heating. In transport, there is, for instance, the procurement of bioenergy buses, so biomethane buses, but also the advancement of electric transport in trams, buses, and metros. And these really linked with the development of renewable power. One aspect which is interesting, and that's why we mention it here, and I already mentioned it, is the municipal waste. Cities are also responsible for the management of their municipal waste and wastewater. And here is a real opportunity to use this waste to produce biogas and biomethane, but also some liquid biofuels, and use them in the transport part. Now, when we're looking at the reality beyond municipal operations, so here cities have the role of policymakers and regulators, facilitators and aggregators, but also as financing entities. And one aspect which is fundamental to mention, considering the fact that buildings represent, I think, approximately 40% of the CO2 emissions in a city or in cities, is the development of building codes. And that's really something where we see that cities use this very much at the city level. The objective, basically, beyond municipal operations, is to facilitate renewable energy deployment for other actors in the urban environment. And here, typically, we have citizens, businesses, communities, places of worship. And for instance, in Amman, they are moving to 100% renewable electricity in the mosques. I think there are something like, I don't recall, but a quite significant amount of mosques in Amman. But also the other aspect is to really have an influence with the mandates on, for instance, urban delivery companies. And I think here we can clearly see the importance of cities, because cities can have an influence on the urban delivery companies, which are very often not local, but more global. And this right away does have an influence on the procurement rules in these urban delivery companies or delivery companies in general. And cities clearly have an influence here which goes beyond their urban space. So as an example, on the regulator and policymaker side, when it comes to the mandates, Chandigarh in India, for instance, mandate the use of solar hot water in industry, hotels, hospitals, prisons, canteens, and housing complexes, as well as in governmental buildings and new residential construction. And that's really, I would say to a certain extent, because this is specifically for new residential constructions too, there are some things which are low-hanging fruit, I think. Cities have, with the building mandate, the possibility to really make a change in terms of avoiding future CO2 emissions, so climate emissions, carbon emissions, by regulating the efficiency, but also the energy supply, renewable energy supply in new buildings, in new districts, for instance, that are being developed. Vancouver in Canada is another example where the building codes require all new buildings to be net zero emission buildings by 2030. In Tübingen, Germany, building codes require the installation of solar PV on all new buildings. And this is, for instance, something which was also announced by New York City in 2019. So there is very clearly, this can have a major impact here. Now, city-wise, in terms of being a facilitator, it's really raising the awareness about the benefits of renewable energy. And I think that's something we can see as a global trend. Cities that did engage in the renewable energy deployment often are very well aware of the benefits of this. And as such, they also tell these positive stories. I think that's really something which is, how do you engage players in the transition? It's make them dream about the future. And cities are key players basically in this context. I think somebody is there who has not muted the phone. Okay. Now, beyond the city, here we have the national level and the global level. And it's very clear that we see cities being champions and trendsetters and advocates here, pushing for higher ambition at the national level and proving the viability of renewable energy, but also having these success stories which are inspiring. And I think, so I really find this example super interesting. Cape Town, for instance, has engaged since a longer time in clear urban decarbonization strategy, and came now to a point where it was difficult for them just because the national framework does not allow them to decide from which power producer they can buy their electricity. And as a result, Cape Town is now building up a court case to make sure that they will be able to purchase renewable electricity from an independent power producer. And this would indeed have direct implications on the national framework. Now, I've mentioned before the way cities also raise their voices, and I think this is really something which is really interesting. There are some global networks, so I will focus on the global networks here. With the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, for instance, nearly 10,000 cities and local governments representing 770 million people jointly reduce basically, or are committed to reduce CO2 emissions. With ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability Network, more than 1,750 local and regional governments are committed to sustainable urban development. C40 City, the Climate Leadership Group, is connecting 94 cities that are committed to deliver the Paris Agreement at the local level, but also reduce air pollution. And we also see basically there is always this question: what happens? So, what was the reaction of players when Trump decided to step back from the Paris Agreement? In the US, 280 city leaders have joined the We're Still in movement. Now, I think it's really important to say that cities cannot advance renewable energy transition in isolation. And that is something which is really important, because we do see that the governance of cities in general, beyond the energy topic, really has a major influence on the power of cities. On the power of cities, because it does have an influence on financial resources of cities, on human resources of cities, on their competencies, on their political authority. Basically, it is very much defined by the national frameworks. That's one aspect. The other aspect, however, is that obviously advancing the transition, the energy transition, just in an isolated way, especially in space-constrained cities, can be challenging. And this is also where we see that the integration with the suburban environment, with the rural environment, can be fundamental, or is fundamental. And the other aspect is that so renewable energy, luckily, is not only driven at the city level, but also at the country level, at the national government's level. And there are also regulations which do have an influence on how cities operate. I spoke about the influence here, and I think it is very important to remind ourselves that the support for renewable energy is not only supporting renewable energy and supportive regulative frameworks, policies and regulative frameworks, but it is also creating a level playing field. National subsidies for urban fossil fuel consumption clearly have an influence on the markets at the city level. And this is, for instance, an example where this interference from the national policy framework to the city is not always in favor of renewable energy deployment. There are some data here, I don't recall which source this is, but which have assessed basically how this translates into subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies at the city level. And here we see that there is 13.8 billion for transport, 10.6 billion for households, 10.3 billion for industry and businesses, 7 billion for electricity and production supply. And these are basically parameters that significantly influence renewable energy uptake. It's very clear that policy alignment is needed, and phasing out fossil fuel subsidy is fundamental. Now, a positive example when we look into what is helping cities actually to govern their energy part is the ownership of utilities. So municipal utilities, when they are owned, so we see that there are different ownership models here. When they are owned, obviously the city government does have a major, they are responsible for driving the energy transition, not only at the municipal level, but at the city level, and they can directly define the strategy of their utilities. Here we have some examples in Barcelona in Spain, Munich in Germany. I mean, there are many of these. Sorry, And we see, however, that we also see municipal utilities in Japan or South Africa, for instance, or in the US. In general, we can say, however, that national utilities are still predominant in most other regions of the world. And that's certainly something where the reality, the new reality of renewable energy, which is local, it's not a new reality, but the reality of renewable energy, that there is a possibility to produce locally and consume locally, to also broaden the discussion from electricity to other energy parts, is a clear opportunity to also discuss and rediscuss the municipal ownership part. And we have some examples, for instance, where there was a big push, for instance, of citizens in Hamburg to re-municipalize the electric grid. So this discussion is also very strongly linked to citizens' involvement. Now, I mentioned before that policies and regulatory frameworks are fundamental to drive renewable energy development in markets and the markets. And obviously, I'll be really honest, it is quite complicated to have consolidated data globally on what the markets are today, renewable energy markets in cities. And this is certainly something which we will build up over time. That's also why it's not a one-off report, but a report series. And I take this as an opportunity to call on everybody to contribute data here. Now, here is the first overview on the data we have consolidated and could consolidate. When we're looking into renewable power in cities, we clearly see that there is a shift to consume renewable energy power, but also to produce, basically to distribute renewable energy generation. And what is interesting here is that we see that at least 100 cities worldwide use 70% or more of renewable electricity. So this is basically the self-reporting. Sorry, the slide before, which was on target, was not self-reporting. This was really consolidated data. Please apologize. I apologize for this error. When we are speaking about power, it is very clear that street lighting is one of the first entry points historically. And this is explained by the fact that municipal public lighting can account for up to 30% of the municipal electricity budget. So here is directly an economic interest to move to solar-powered street lighting. And globally, there is nearly 5,800 action plans that have been submitted basically under the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which do include the use of energy efficient and renewable energy in public lighting. In 2017, street lighting reached 3.8 billion units cumulative, and it's really a market which is forecasted to grow significantly. And globally, I mean, we also see that, for instance, in Kampala and Uganda, solar street lighting has basically greatly reduced upfront installation costs. And there are examples in Burundi, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Togo. So it is something which is, but also in Asia and the Pacific, Middle East, yeah, there is a real global opportunities. Now, when we're looking into renewable heating and cooling in cities, there are basically two entry points to this. One is to develop and deploy standalone systems that are typically on building facades and rooftops. Very well-known solar thermal applications, but also geothermal to some extent, the combination of electricity with heat pumps. So there is clearly standalone systems, but also the development of district heating and cooling networks. And here, I think what is important to mention is obviously in countries, or sorry, in cities that are quite dense, it is difficult to develop district heating and cooling networks in areas which are already existing, but it is really something where urban planning comes into account. When it comes, we're talking about cities that will continue to grow. So integrating district heating and cooling networks in these cities and growing cities is a key entry point to develop higher shares of renewable energy in this end-use sector. Today, district heating networks only cover approximately, I think, 12% basically of the heating demand worldwide. When we're looking into the role of renewable energy in district heating, this is provided to 95% by biomass. We do see, and this is shown on the slide, that there is a development of solar district heating systems, which has been increasing over the last year. I mean, there's a continuous trend. 2017 was not a very good year because of policy reviews in China, actually, if I'm not mistaken. And what we see here, however, is that the cumulative collector capacity in operation within Europe represent the bigger part. So excuse me, this was not district heating is in Europe, not in China. I'm mixing up things. Sorry for that. I spoke about the role of mandates, and I think here, since the building sector is so fundamental, it is important to mention the net zero buildings and districts. Buildings represent over half of city emissions. Building codes can regulate these emissions and energy supply here, and there are net zero buildings that are defined. These are defined as highly energy efficient buildings that are fully powered from renewable energy sources, on-site or off-site. That's something which can be adapted. So very clearly, net zero energy buildings or net zero emission buildings are a major opportunity to also have a stronger integration of efficiency and energy efficiency. So of planning, the conceptual part, efficiency and renewable energy. The C40 cities, for instance, have a net zero carbon buildings declaration, where mayors from 25 cities worldwide have, from Europe, North America, and also 4 cities from South Africa, are engaging and pledge that all new buildings will be net zero starting from 2030. So I think this is really something which is fundamental. They also pledge that all new and existing building will meet the standard by 2050. Planning goes beyond just one building, but also toward the district, and that's really something which I think we cannot underline sufficiently the role of urban planning here. In general, when we're talking about the energy transition. And we see more and more globally the development also from net zero energy districts that are gaining popularity. Again, some examples also to illustrate that it's not only happening in Europe. So for instance, in Palava, Mumbai, India, there are net zero emission standards, net zero energy standards for buildings. And they also adopt basically a rooftop solar PV to mandate solar rooftop PV to reach these standards. Another example is in Hazelwood Green in Pittsburgh, US, where the city aims to achieve net zero energy standards by adopting renewable energy solution, and in quite an integrated way, because this district basically is composed of residential, industrial, retail, and office buildings, which have different energy use patterns and load profiles. And there is a real opportunity to optimize basically the energy production and demand. I'm coming to renewable energy and transport. I think this is a very interesting sector, also a tricky sector, because it is the entry points are obviously the fuel, but also the vehicles and the infrastructure. So on the fuel, we do see that there are many mandates at the biofuel mandates, very often at the national level. But also at the city level, often the development of biomethane for the use in natural gas vehicles. And with the electric mobility, there is a possibility of a renewable electricity use. And this is where it's really interesting to see how municipalities can also influence significantly the development of renewable energy by procuring specific vehicle types, or also giving access for specific vehicle types to cities' environment. This is valid on the municipal vehicles part for rails, buses, municipal fleets, and waste trucks. Here we see the electricity part, but also for urban actors, in particular passenger cars, but also freight. And here the choice of the vehicle is a key leverage to allow for the integration of renewable energy. The other aspect is also the development of supporting infrastructure. This is true when we're talking about e-mobility with the charging stations, but also when we're talking about natural gas vehicles, or in the future hydrogen vehicles. I mean, in the future, there are already some cities doing this, but it's still more a niche market where there is a possibility, where it is fundamental to invest in the infrastructure to be able to allow the integration of renewable energy. So as a matter of time, I will rush through some of these slides. I think it's important to see that the electric vehicles in cities is not only three-wheeler electric cars, but also two-wheelers and three-wheelers, but also electric buses, metros, and trams. And here you see the development of the electric bus stocks, for instance, in cities. And we do see that obviously China is the bulk of these electric buses, with almost 418,000 units. The rest of the world is approximately 3,700 units. What is interesting, however, is the starting point is small, but the growth rate over the last 3 years, so between 2015 and 2018, has been approximately the same, and of 56%. So I think this is a really good indication that many cities are engaging basically in this. When we're looking at the electric vehicles, this is the market development per region. And I think what is really important to mention here, without going into the global data, is yes, there is a concentration in some cities, in particular, in some countries in China and the US, but there is also a concentration in cities, because cities play a very important role. As of late 2018, 40% of all electric vehicles in use were clustered in 20 cities. And these account for a population of 3%. So I think it clearly underlines the role cities play in moving the transition. And it also underlines how important it is that cities also care about where the electricity comes from. Now, on finance, this is clearly a tricky topic. Cities do use financing sources and models based, so business models actually, to access finance. Finance is clearly needed to accelerate the urban energy transition. Now, the mandate and municipalities' economic resources depend very much on the overall city's governance. And this clearly shows that cities, if we really want to build on cities as change agents in advancing renewable energy, it is important to empower them also economically. Because often municipalities lack their own funds, and they also don't have many dedicated finance lines or funding lines that allow them to access external finance. So in general, you can say that cities can invest themselves by using their own, allocating their own budgets, but also accessing external finance. What we see clearly is when we're looking into business models, smart business models, is that the reality often is that renewable energy development also allows to create local income, so economic income at the municipal level, but also reduce costs. And this really frees up possibilities. Now, I will. On the external finance part, the key instruments are bonds, obviously public-private partnership. We see a trend that municipalities are building much more on private investors. Land value capture, here it's about harvesting property value to finance new infrastructure projects, and also some dedicated funds. The challenge, as I said, is really the lack of own funds and external access to external funds. I will move to one last slide because I think it is important before we move to the Q&A. Sorry, I think I took it's a lot of material actually. So citizens are living in cities and are key players in cities, and citizens' engagement for the energy transition is clearly a development we see. It's also an opportunity we see. We have consumer choices which can be supported, which are also reality. So there is also a demand of citizens from municipalities to engage in the transition. These citizens can become prosumers, building on local production. And cities can also enable community renewable energy projects. with partly a participatory governance. And I mentioned this Hamburg part. There are clearly some cities where we see developments of remunicipalization and public ownership. I think one aspect here is really interesting too, and that's with regard to space constraint. Citizens in cities, there are also possibilities to really develop community energy projects which go beyond the city border and involve citizens and the advantages of citizens and the realities basically in suburban and rural areas. So using the economic power in cities, but the space, for instance, in rural area, and that's clearly some things where we see some example. Now, what is the conclusion? I think the conclusion clearly is that we see a lot of development, that we see a lot of data, information, but that there is a clear need to continuously consolidate this information, to have a better data basis to inform decisions. That's the first thing. So basically the work is not over after this report. The other part is renewables are here to stay, and that's something which is also very clear. And cities do play a key role with their urban planning role, with the fact that all end-use sectors are in the cities, but also their understanding for the different drivers. Cities have a key role in advancing the transition in a more integrated approach. But also in an approach of communication, awareness raising, etc., which allows to really relate renewable energy to cities and citizens' needs. So I take again this example of air pollution. Citizens really want clean air. Municipal governments have the responsibility for providing healthy environments. And here there is a clear possibility to position renewable energy in a very different way than the discussion we often observe at the national level. So there are opportunities renewable offer to cities, but also cities offer opportunities for renewable energy development. In general, we can say that there is really a lead to align policies across the national, subnational, and the local level, to encourage sector integration, but also to empower cities in their active role they can play. And we need vision, ambition, and policies, and cities working together to really also inspire national governments, in particular when we are talking about the national determined contributions, which will be renegotiated next year, to really be ambitious here and take the climate crisis seriously. So one last comment, I've mentioned it, this endeavor is only starting here. And we are really looking forward to engage with many more players to produce even more solid databases and dynamic discussions around the topic of renewable in cities and cities in renewable. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rana, for a very terrific and informative presentation. It's really exciting to learn what cities are doing in the renewable energy space. And I'd really like to congratulate you and Leah, Ronaldo, and the entire REN21 team on the launch of this very important report series. So huge congratulations to you. So much happens or can happen at the local level, and the value of this report, it really cannot be overstated. So with that, now it's time to address questions coming in from our audience. And I'd like to turn over and invite and welcome Laura Williamson to moderate. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Rana, for the presentation. So we've got some interesting questions coming in. I encourage others of you that have questions to type them in the question box, and we'll see how many of them we can get to before the end of this questionnaire, this presentation. One of them, Rana, actually follows on your slide quite well of citizen participation, talking about the issue of wheeling, where you generate inside the transmission system, but the consumption is elsewhere. And you had referenced the fact of cities interacting with maybe more rural areas where you have the population density in one space and then you have the geographical space on the outside. This question actually is the inverse, which is, should municipalities see wheeling, so the consumption not in the same place as the transmission, as a threat or as an opportunity?
I think it's not black and white. It is a threat in. It's probably a threat in countries where cities, governance-wise, do not have the right to produce themselves the energy. So here it is challenging because it is then very often an argument which is being used to not support the fact that cities could be their own energy producer. It is, however, a real opportunity, because we do see that when we're talking about, and this is in particular true for the electricity sector, so the power sector and grids here, that the integration of different load profiles, so different demands and production, but also the integration of the different sectors does bring a flexibility which is fundamental when it comes to integrating variable renewable electricity into the grid. So solar, photovoltaic and wind, and in this case it's a real opportunity.
Okay, thank you. The next question is now sort of a bit more specific. It's asking about the opportunities for community solar in the US specifically. I don't know. I mean, I know that there are many different sorts of models. So maybe if you can't talk about the US specifically, sort of what have been sort of roadblocks for community solar in general?
So we do see, I think, that the community, yes, I'm sorry, I cannot speak specifically on the US, but we're happy to get back to you. I will ask Lea Ranalder, the project manager, to get back to you with more details. So I think we have your contact information. In general, we do see that solar PV really has a key advantage in cities, because you can easily integrate it into buildings. Either facades or rooftops, and there are quite interesting cases also where municipalities do make spaces on public buildings available for citizens to invest, and this is something which is a really interesting way of also including basically citizens that are not owner of their buildings into driving the transition, but also bringing investment basically to municipalities and money. So what are here on community energy? To be honest, it depends very often. The definition of community energy is not 100% precise, but normally it is clear that citizens need to have, so they're investing, and there is also a governance aspect to this. In general, community energy, I think the trends are that you see them often at the district level, that you can see them around some public spaces also being developed, but also some project developer, renewable energy project developer, really reaching out to cities, to citizens, to engage basically in the development of renewable energy projects. The other part clearly is to develop cooperatives, and this is something which I think is also quite common in the US, where citizens come together to develop a cooperative, an energy cooperative, and where there is a production, but also distribution. Plus, there is obviously digitalization also allows for new business models here. And I'm really sorry, I'm here again. I'm very happy to ask the team to get back to you with some details on the different business models which do exist, because there are quite interesting ones which are also addressed in the report, I think, on the solar leasing parts, yes.
Okay, good. So if you find that your question hasn't been fully answered, we'll make sure to get a more robust answer back to you. But building on that, so we were just talking about solar sort of within communities. if we broaden that a bit, what would you say are the renewable energy technologies that could be deployed well in cities that sort of have the highest possibility for high penetration rates in cities?
So I think this is, there's probably not one single answer, because when we're talking about very density, the situation is very different than, so metropoles, sorry. The situation is quite different than middle-term cities where you don't have the same density. The situation is different when you're close to the sea, for instance, or not. So I think there are different parameters, local parameters to take into account. In general, it's clear that solar PV, solar thermal is something which is possible everywhere. Waste, municipal solid waste, and waste from restaurants, etc., is something which exists everywhere. So here are some resources which can be deployed easily. Then there is, so when we're talking about the heating sector, heat pumps with solar PV as a combination, I think is something which is something we observe. And when we're talking about cities that have district heating systems, we can also see in some areas where geothermal does exist, this will be connected to district heating grids, for instance, with biomass, etc. So I think there are many opportunities. On wind, this depends very much on the local resources. What we do see, however, is that there is also innovation happening where you have kind of urban wind systems developing, and I think it's certainly something which is interesting for the renewable energy transition in cities to particularly look at. We do see that, for instance, in I don't recall whether it was Abu Dhabi or Dubai, where the municipality has, for instance, engaged in building concentrated solar power plant. And the advantage here is that it allows to provide electricity, heating, and cooling, which is fundamental in this region.
So then, building on that, what about mini grids? Is there really an opportunity to deploy mini grids in cities?
Yes, that's very good that you mentioned it. I have not, I did not think about it, but that's something we see very clearly as a trend. When we're looking at the mini grid market, for instance, 50% I think globally of the mini grid market is interestingly in the US, and in response to Katrina, I think was the storm, the hurricane Katrina, because decision makers got aware of the necessity to build up secure and reliable energy provision, which is independent of the overall infrastructure. So we clearly see mini grids here as a development. We see neighborhood grids, and this links back to the community energy again, as a development for resilience reasons. Yes, and here again, so I forgot one of the resources, for instance, in Africa, we see mini-grid-based, micro-hydro-based mini-grids developing to provide also energy access, not only for rural areas, but also in cities.
Okay. Well, here's a question that should warm your heart. It's a question asking, what do you advise individuals who want to help with gathering better data for the cities report, or data in general in this domain, to better track what is happening? What do you advise?
So to be in touch with us, obviously. So very concretely, and I think we'll share the presentation with you. There is at the end, or you can visit our website, which is REN21.net/cities, and here you will find a form where we're specifically asking players to basically subscribe, so that when we will start the data collection process for the next edition, you're basically looped into the process. In general, there are different ways of participating. it's participating really by contributing data on what you're aware of, and this can be on city projects, on policies. It can also be sectoral information. So, for instance, when we're looking into the uptake of renewable energy in transport, the sales of biomethane or natural gas buses or ethanol buses is something which is quite interesting as an indicator. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is to participate as reviewer of the report drafts. And since it is really a new undertaking, we will, in view of the next edition of the report, have a survey where we are really asking for feedback on this current edition, because it's a continuous development, and we really are very, very interested in also making this report series evolve in a way that it serves basically the different decision makers best.
So people can then go on the website, that form you showed, and fill that in to stay involved. Yes. Okay. Exactly. Okay. I have another question here. It's asking for sort of lead by example, so sort of good activities or programs. Are there examples that really drive behavior change with the private sector or in the residential sector to increase the uptake of renewables?
There is one example which is not directly a renewable energy example, but I found this super interesting. And unfortunately, I don't recall which city it was. It was somewhere in, I think it was in Sweden, where the first electric bus stop was built within the public and the university library. And I think this is something which is, it really changes the perception right away in a very, very significant way. We do see a trend, and I think this is something which is linked to the fact that cities here, any city does have an influence on how they manage basically their municipal buildings. So here we do see that when you have cultural buildings, for instance, administrative buildings, mosques, as in the case of Amman, we do see that developing, for instance, net zero emission buildings here is clearly changing the way players and citizens perceive this, because these are spaces, so they are choosing spaces where the citizens will also come normally, naturally, and as a result, this really allows to address basically existing myths which are still out there. Oh, if you're living in a net zero emission building, you will always freeze, or your beer will not be cold, or whatsoever. To really see that no, renewable based and efficient buildings can provide a high quality environment for living, working, and producing energy, consuming energy.
Thank you. You had mentioned towards the end of your presentation the issue of finance, and that it's a complicated issue because of the various levels and the various kind of funding entities. This question here is wanting to sort of know what kind of options were identified in this research or in this publication that's looking at the public or private financing at the city level.
So sorry, I'm going to. So as I said, I mean, there is indeed there are some bonds which are specific. These allow cities to access, for instance, longer-term finance at stable prices. So we also saw that the bond market is really leveraged more and more by climate investment, including renewable energy projects. And globally, it has reached something like $100 trillion US. So I think that's an interesting development which is identified. And here we'll have municipal and green bonds. So cities can access basically these financing mechanisms. The other part is clearly, I mentioned this, public-private partnership. And I think that is something we see more and more in cities, and where we also see that, for instance, procurement contracts of cities can be quite innovative. It can be procurement or operation contracts which are not directly linked to the energy discussion or topic, but where the income will then again be reallocated for renewable energy projects and developments. Obviously, then public-private partnerships. I think this is something which is very present. And there is certainly a real opportunity here, because I think when we're looking at the change agents or the players really driving ambition today, there are probably three groups. I mean, we all are aware of the Fridays for Future development. There is the cities, which show and where we hear an increasing ambition, and they also have a very strong voice. But there is also the industry and businesses that are consuming energy. So there are no energy players, but they are consuming energy. And interestingly, these are very, very interested in increasing their activities also in cities that are engaging. Basically, there is a green label cities, and so there is interesting opportunities for developing public-private partnerships in a different way. And the other part is specific dedicated funds, for instance, of multilateral development banks or green banks. But this is obviously something multilateral development banks normally will operate with a national government. So again, the governance structure in a country will really indicate whether this is an option or not. But finance, I think, is certainly a field which will need much more attention in the future to really empower cities to move from the ambition to action.
Okay, thank you. So we've seen this big global presentation, lots of data and information. When you look at the facts that are presented in this year's this first report of this series, what do you see? Is it hopeful? Is it discouraging?
So it's always a question: are we positive or negative, optimist or pessimist? I think my answer today is really, and since a while, probably also to not become cynical, but is realistic about the opportunities and realistic about the challenges. And I think, and this report really underlines it. In a natural way, cities really represent key opportunities. They represent key opportunities also because they think about renewable energy or energy in a different way, and really allow to link basically this energy debate where at the national level we come very much from the supply side more to the consumption side, more to the benefits of developing renewable energy, like air pollution, like citizens' involvement, like governance, so energy democracy, for instance, and also economic benefits. So I think here is a real interesting opportunity. The other opportunity is also that cities can fundamentally contribute to address the not in my backyard phenomenon. And I think that is something which is fundamental. It's fundamental when we're also talking about the just transition, because linking the economic developments with social development is something where there is another tension at the city level, and city governments take this into account differently. I'm realistic about the challenges, and these come down to the general governance of cities, where unfortunately we still have many countries where cities are not empowered in their role of change agents, in their role of pioneers and trendsetters. That's one aspect, and the other aspect is also that obviously city power, I guess, depends very much on the economic situation and resources they have available. And I think here there are, for me, two areas that need specific strategic intention. And need to be addressed in a stronger multi-level governance vertical integration debate, and not only, I guess, a debate or the goodwill announcements, but a clear strategy on how to bring these governance level together.
Thank you. So Vicky, do we have time for one last question?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, so, REN21 is based in Europe, lots of data, lots of information. When you compare Europe to the rest of the world, who do you think has the better process?
So this is one thing which is interesting. Again, we do see some regional trends, but I would say that You will find many cities in Europe that are leading and advancing and really supporting the renewable energy development. You will also find many cities that don't. And this is also the beauty of it. I think that cities driving renewable energy, we encounter them everywhere in the world. And there are, just because the benefits of renewable energy are universal to some extent. And I think that's really something which is they are universal and they are very concrete at the city level. And as such, it's for cities sometimes quite easy, I guess, at the local level to mobilize the different stakeholders. Obviously, and this comes again to the governance level, it also comes to the existing infrastructures in the city. The situation is different when you're talking about renewable energy deployment in Europe, where cities are very much empowered governance-wise, or when you speak, for instance, about cities in Africa or Asia. In particular, when we're looking at Africa, where very often cities handle basic infrastructure questions of streets, access to energy, access to water, waste management, renewable energy might not always be their priority. And I think this is something where, as a community, we really have a role to play also to inform that for these cities in particular, they have a major opportunity to integrate efficiency and renewable energy in their urban planning, in the infrastructure design, in a very strategic way, and as such develop basically sustainable, much more sustainable cities.
So hence the reason, the importance of continuing this series.
Exactly. And one of the many reasons.
Well, thank you very much for everybody for your questions. I hope that Rana managed to respond to them. I know she flagged a couple where she will ask the cities team to provide a few more details. But if we didn't manage to get to all your questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. So Vicky, I pass it back to you.
Terrific, great. First of all, Rana and Laura, thank you again so much for the presentation, and also Laura, great job moderating the questions. Real quickly, if there are any additional final thoughts or closing remarks both of you would like to make to the audience, any announcements on future products coming out, I would like to give you a chance to do that.
Yeah. So yes, I would like to thank this audience, because it's our first audience to share basically this moment of the first city presentation we do after the launch of the report. So that's something I would also really like to use this opportunity to thank basically the project management team here in the REN21 Secretariat. So in particular, Leah Ranalder as a project manager, for driving this endeavor, but also the broader community for engaging here, and also in particular the advisory committee where all major city networks participated. I think this is really where the spirit of renewable energy community is a huge strength, and also I see this as an opportunity to basically bridge the different sectors between renewable energy and cities. And this leads me to the next part, that I really, if you're interested by this topic, please join this very dynamic community. And I think REN21 in this endeavor needs all contributors, but also this community needs to build on each other to accelerate renewable uptake and address climate change.
Great. Thanks, Rana. Laura, any final remarks from you that you'd like to make?
No, thanks for the great questions. Thanks for your participation.
Okay, thanks again. So, all wonderful. And lastly, I'd also like to extend a very hearty thank you to our attendees. We really very much appreciate your participation and your time, and we hope that you found today's webinar valuable and you're taking away good information that is helpful in both your professional and your personal lives. And just a quick reminder that a short survey will pop up after we end the webinar. And we really appreciate you taking a minute or two to answer the survey questions. So with that, I send you all good wishes All good wishes, and this concludes our webinar.